million people, 65% of the total population, 650 million people lived in poverty. And incredibly, in the 20 years before he was born, some 50 million people died of famine. Now, the world today is a very different place, and the world in 2030 is going to be still yet a different place from what it is today. The population, for starters, will have increased by 1 billion people, from 7.3 billion people today to 8.3 billion. That's increasing in only 15 years the entire population when my grandfather was born. Half the world's population will be living in areas of high water stress. Now, we're on a trajectory to facing some serious issues with food security. There's certain projections out there that by 2050, we'll be headed towards a 70% food gap. Today, we celebrate the success of halving extreme poverty since 1990, and we've done a phenomenal job in that regard. But still, 730 million people live on less than $1.9 a day. We face significant problems with inequality. By some accounts, the global top 1% people own more than 50% of the economic assets on the planet, and that's estimated to be about $250 trillion. We're facing significant problems with the planet in terms of our security, and so on and so forth. So last September, world leaders met in New York to agree an ambitious new agenda for development called Agenda 2030, focusing on sustainable development. And they agreed 17 sustainable development goals and 169 targets. Now, I'm not going to read out all these targets to you today, but the conference organizers have given you a paper and the targets are listed there. They're very ambitious, and in fact, they're not just ambitious, they're really revolutionary. And if fully implemented, and we achieve the goals, we will have decoupled economic growth from environmental plunder. And that really is the point. We cannot grow endlessly unless we root our development in sustainable development. So how are we going to achieve these goals? Are we on track? Now, the food on our plate provides us with an interesting lens at which to look at sustainability. And I thought I would look at my own food consumption here to give you a sense of what some of the challenges might be. And it so happens that my favorite food, my comfort food, happens to be a plate of fish and chips. That's deep-fried cod or haddock with chips, French fries, they call them in the US, mushy peas, tomato sauce on the side, and a glass of bitter. Now, for the better part of a century, we've followed the same 5-step recipe again and again on farm after farm and after farm to supply the world with food. First, the first ingredient is we've overharvested wild populations. Now, we've talked about fisheries. 70% of fish stocks around the world are either overharvested or harvested at capacity currently. North Atlantic cod, key ingredient in fish and chips in North America, collapsed in 1992 and is still not fully recovered. And over 5 million tons of bushmeat are consumed annually in the Congo Basin alone. And globally, the $23 billion trade in illicit trade in wildlife. A large chunk of that, particularly in Asia, is for food consumption. The next step is we've converted habitats and degraded land for agriculture on a massive scale. Now, the oil palm that is in the UK, the most popular choice oil for fish and for frying fish, has pushed rhinos, elephants, tigers, orangutans to the brink of extinction, extirpated them over large areas in Sumatra, and significant impacts on habitats all around the world. And of course, this loss of forests is responsible for significant greenhouse gas emissions, as Minister Helgesen pointed out. We're losing 75 billion tons of soil from poor agricultural practices globally, and our animal husbandry, that is grazing, overgrazing of our livestock, are leading to desertification, arid drylands globally. And I might add that here we're using 140 million tons of chemical fertilizer, and this is having a major impact in terms of providing phosphorus and nitrogen overloads in our wetlands. The third step is reducing diversity. We used to eat some 7,000 species of plants. Today, we're down to just 12. It's the bulk of our diet based on just 12 species. 3 species, that's wheat, rice, and maize, provide 50% of our calories. Now that's an issue. We're eating fewer things, but we're losing the diversity within species. Now, in the US, where I now live, I try in the short growing season to have a small farm, or a small, home garden. Now, in 1900, when my grandfather was born, for the top 10 common vegetables available in the US, things like carrots and so on, you'd have been able to buy some 3,800 different varieties. Now, today, if I try to do the same, there's just 310 available on the market. So that's when I try to plant in my little home garden. At the same time, we're losing crop wild relatives. Now, that's a really serious problem, because we need them to maintain the vigor of their cultivated relatives, and some 70% of essential crop wild relative species in urgent need of protection. And this is really critical in the context of climate change. Take coffee, for those of you who like to drink coffee after your fish and chips. We're going to expect by 2050, we're going to be reducing the area because of climate change suitable for Arabica coffee bean production, while global coffee demand is likely to double. And it's not just coffee, but it's grapes and cherries and maple syrup and corn and chocolate. And I'm afraid to say the hops in my bitter as well. Global food policies have had a pernicious impact on people. Now, we've tended to focus on large farms, rich farmers, in terms of our agricultural support systems. Some 500 million small farms provide 80% of the food in the developing world. And for them, the big subsidies that have provided large farmers tend to crowd them out. $500 billion worth of subsidies, which are leading to significant losses in income, some 24 billion globally for some of the poorest communities. That's really significant. We've talked about that in previous Trondheim conferences, but it's something we mustn't forget. 43% of the world's farmers are women, and yet women receive a fraction, some places as little as 5% of the agricultural inputs enjoyed by men. That's extension services, that's access to finance and credit and so on and so forth, access to technology. So we're leaving them out of the picture. The fifth step is overuse of resources, and Minister Helgesen has already spoken about the fact that a third of food is wasted. In the US, where I live, it's 50%, it's massive. We tend to waste food in the US, and I guess here in Norway, at home, in the fridge, at a restaurant. In developing countries, it tends to be lost on farm, or it tends to be lost in storage. A lot of it lost, for instance, with rats and so on, feasting on grains. And that's a big problem when we then get rid of the owls and the snakes and so on and so forth, which eat the rats. And that is an issue in some parts of the world today. The kind of food we eat has a major impact. Now, I focus on fish and chips, that's what I like to eat, and I don't eat beef. But beef happens to be the most resource-intensive source of fat and protein. And a pound of beef requires 7 kilos of feed for every kilo of live weight. Now, that's compared to a ratio of 2:1 for chicken. And in the US, cattle feedlots produce some 500 million tons of manure, and that's 3 times the quantity of human sewage produced globally. That's quite phenomenal, isn't it? Now, it's important this, because meat consumption is expected to increase from 149 kilos per person to 161 kilos per person by 2030. So we're going to eat more meat. So what's the impact of that going to be? Now, I love my fish and chips, and it's my comfort food. But eaten in large quantities, it's not a comfort. It's not a comfort to me health-wise, because a plate of fish and chips is some 1,600 to 1,800 calories, and it's full of saturated fat. And so therefore, perhaps not too healthy. But it's also uncomfortable for the environment for the reasons I pointed out: overfishing, the use of oil palm for frying, the loss of diversity, important to the tomatoes you eat in the tomato sauce, the peas, the potatoes, and so on and so forth. And of course, the loss of wild diversity too, and then impact of climate change. So we need a new formula. We need a new recipe for producing food. And I think that's what we're here this week in Trondheim to discuss. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals provide us with a pathway towards finding that recipe. They were developed with the view that they be indivisible, that we don't cherry pick them. There's 17 of them there for a purpose, and that's because we realize that the challenges that the world sees today are not challenges that can be addressed by dealing with them one by one, silo by silo. We need to deal with them in an integrated way. And so therefore, as we look to the Sustainable Development Agenda, we need to ask ourselves, what are the solutions, and how might the solutions for food be solutions for other things as well? Solutions for gender, solutions for poverty, solutions for dealing with inequality, solutions for water, and so on. We need to join these dots. So looking at some of these solutions, starting with step 1, I have 5, we need to reverse the manner in which we harvest wild populations of plants and animals. We need to reduce our impact on the wilds. And we can do that. We've seen that in fisheries, the huge benefits of creating marine protected areas in Tanzania, a 10-fold increase in fish productivity, increase in spawning biomass from the creation of fish set-asides. And by some estimates, we could increase fish production from sustainable fish management by 100 million metric tons by 2050. Second, we need to decouple food production from deforestation and land degradation. And to do this, we're going to need to restore degraded land. There is a target in the Sustainable Development Agenda focused on land degradation neutrality. This is a very important one, and it's one we need to focus on, because otherwise we're just going to continue converting our wildlands to meet for increasing food production needs. The third step is going to be fostering diversity in order to increase resilience. Now, I say this on the right, you see examples of different goals that these actions might have an impact upon. And here, really it is an imperative in terms of climate change. If we don't build resilience in our food systems, we're going to have a big problem into the future, and we need to maintain our agricultural genetic diversity. And of course, this is good for the economy too. The use of a particular gene from one wild tomato plant has increased tomato solids, increased value to the tomato industry by $250 million a year. Then we're going to need to have more inclusive food policies that address poverty. And here we're going to need to deal with the gender disparity in terms of agriculture systems. If we can address the needs of women-owned farms, we can increase their production by 20 to 30%. We can reduce hunger globally by 150 million. So that's something where we address the gender goal, we address hunger, we're doing the right thing, and we're dealing with improving food security. We've got to deal with the smallholders. We've got to deal with the 500 million farms that produce 80% of our food. An increase in just 1% of agricultural exports would increase Africa's GDP by 70 billion, and some work UNDP is doing, which we'll publish shortly, shows that that is also a good investment in terms of reducing inequality. And then we need to reduce our waste. We need to increase the efficiency of our agricultural production systems and reduce the use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides. And here's one issue. Erik Solheim last week, he tweeted, he was excited about the resolution at the United Nations Environment Assembly on plastics. And that's a serious issue because by some accounts, and this is controversial, by 2050 there'll be more plastics in the ocean by weight than biomass of fish. Now that's just based on a calculus of looking at the arithmetic of overfishing and increase of plastics in the oceans. But it's a fact that plastics are making their way into our food chains. And in California recently, a study showed that 1 in 4 fish had plastics in their flesh. So when my grandfather was born, the world has a much smaller population than it is today. We still face significant challenges. We talked about the challenge of famine. It's changed remarkably and mostly for the better. We've largely been able to look after our larger population, and that's quite amazing. That's the product of the Green Revolution and so on. Fact is that 1 in 9 people every day still go to bed hungry, and 2 billion people are micronutrient deficient. So we have a long way to go. So my question is, what is the world going to look like for our grandchildren? Now, I don't have any children, but I did become last night a great uncle. And I'm going to wonder what her future is going to be. She grows up in England. And I think we've all got to look to the future, and we've got to look to the future with a sense of hope, but we need to be honest about the challenges that we confront, because I think we're often dishonest. And just to say that the agenda for sustainable development is universal. unlike the Millennium Development Goals, which apply to developing countries. And that means here in Norway, or in Estonia, or in Australia, it's as relevant to your development agenda as it is in Argentina, or Ecuador, or Bhutan. So we've got to apply it domestically. You're going to need to apply it at subnational level too. We don't think it's possible to address the agenda goal by goal and all 169 targets by 169 targets. We're going to need to identify catalysts. These are actions, if they're successful, they're going to lift up a number of goals and targets. We're going to use a rising tide lifts all ships. And I'd like us to think about our investment in food as being such a catalyst. It's one that can address biodiversity loss, both in the seas and on land, can address climate change by improving our resilience and mitigation by reducing forest loss, contribute to sustainable production and consumption, contribute to the eradication of poverty, improve equality across the planet, the status of women, and water security. Thank you very much.